She signed the contract with trembling hands, believing it would last only 6 months, a marriage of convenience to save her family from ruin, nothing more. He was the Duke of Ashford, cold and distant, needing a bride to secure his inheritance. But on their wedding night, as candlelight flickered across his face and his fingers traced her jaw with unexpected tenderness, he whispered words that shattered every carefully built wall between them. "This union stands, always, tonight." In that moment, Lady Eleanor Everhart realized the pretense had become devastatingly, irrevocably real, and her heart belonged to a man she was contracted to leave. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. The rain hammered against the mullioned windows of Thornbury Manor with the relentless fury of an English autumn storm, each drop an accusation against the glass. Inside the drawing room, Lady Eleanor Everhart sat ramrod straight in a chair that had belonged to her grandmother, her hands folded demurely in her lap, her heart hammering a desperate rhythm against her ribs. The room smelled of beeswax and old leather, of generations of Everharts who had lived and loved and died within these walls, walls that would soon belong to strangers if she failed in the task before her. Across from her, behind a massive mahogany desk that seemed designed to intimidate, sat Mr. Aldous Pembroke, her father's solicitor. His face was all sharp angles and disapproval, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose like a bird of prey preparing to swoop. He had been speaking for what felt like hours, his voice a monotonous drone, detailing the catastrophic extent of her family's financial ruin. "The late Earl, your father, God rest his soul, made certain investments," Pembroke intoned, shuffling papers with bureaucratic precision. "Investments that proved disastrous. The American railway scheme, the Peruvian silver mines, the speculative ventures in Australian wool, all failed spectacularly. The debts amount to £73,000, a sum that I'm afraid cannot be resolved through any conventional means." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. £73,000. It was an impossible, crushing weight. Beside her, her younger brother Thomas, only 17, still soft-faced with youth, made a strangled sound in his throat. Their mother, Lady Margaret Everhart, sat near the fireplace, her face pale as parchment, her hands worrying a handkerchief into submission. "Thornbury Manor will be seized," Pembroke continued mercilessly. "The London townhouse, the Scottish estate, all properties will be liquidated. Your mother's jointure, I'm afraid, will barely suffice for modest lodgings. Your brother's commission in the regiment will be impossible to purchase. As for you, Lady Eleanor," he peered at her over his spectacles, "without a dowry, without family connections that aren't tainted by scandal, your marriage prospects have rather evaporated." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor had known, of course, that things were dire. Her father's sudden death 3 months prior had revealed a labyrinth of bad decisions and worse luck. But hearing it stated so baldly, so finally, made it devastatingly real. "There is, however," Pembroke said, and something in his tone made Eleanor's spine stiffen with wariness. "One potential solution. Unorthodox, certainly, but under the circumstances—" He slid a thick document across the desk toward her. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes scanning the elaborate script, the formal language that seemed designed to obscure as much as illuminate. 2 words leapt out at her, stark and impossible. "Marriage contract." "The Duke of Ashford," Pembroke explained, "finds himself in need of a wife. Rather urgently, I'm given to understand. His Grace inherited the dukedom 18 months ago upon the death of his uncle. However, the will contains a rather unusual stipulation. The Duke must be married before his 30th birthday, or the entirety of the Ashford estates, some 200,000 acres, 7 manors, investments worth £500,000, revert to his cousin, Mr. Bartholomew Ashford, a gentleman of questionable character. Eleanor's mind raced. She knew of the Duke of Ashford, though she had never met him. Alexander Colton, the Duke of Ashford, was renowned for his reclusiveness, his cold demeanour, his absolute disinterest in society. He had spent the past decade in diplomatic service on the continent, returning to England only upon inheriting his title. The gossip mills of London had churned endlessly about his stern countenance, his reputation for brilliant but ruthless negotiations, his complete immunity to the charms of débutantes paraded before him. "The Duke's 30th birthday is in 6 months," Pembroke continued. "He requires a bride immediately. The marriage, however, need not be permanent. After a suitable period, 1 year perhaps, a quiet separation could be arranged. An annulment on grounds of non-consummation, or if necessary, a discreet divorce citing incompatibility. You would retain your title as Duchess, receive a generous settlement, and your family's debts would be cleared entirely." "You're asking me to enter into a sham marriage," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "To deceive society, to live a lie. I'm asking you to save your family from utter destruction," Pembroke replied with brutal honesty. "Your mother from destitution, your brother from a life of poverty with no prospects, yourself from—" He paused delicately. "From whatever fate awaits penniless gentlewomen of good birth, governessing perhaps, companion to some tyrannical dowager, or worse." The unspoken possibilities hung in the air. Eleanor had heard the stories, gently bred women forced into impossible situations, their descent swift and merciless. She looked at her mother, saw the desperate hope warring with shame in her eyes. She looked at Thomas, barely more than a boy, trying so hard to appear strong and failing. "What does the Duke require of me?" Eleanor asked finally. "During this arrangement, discretion above all," Pembroke replied. "You would reside at Ashford House in London initially, appear together at necessary social functions to establish the marriage as legitimate. After 6 months, once the inheritance is secured, you would retire to one of the country estates. The Duke has indicated he has no desire for intimacy, no expectation of heirs. This is purely a business arrangement to satisfy the terms of his uncle's will. A business arrangement, a cold, calculated exchange, her name and respectability for his money and her family's salvation." Eleanor felt something shrivel inside her, some girlish dream of love and partnership that she had scarcely admitted even to herself. She had always imagined, in her most private moments, a marriage built on mutual respect and affection, perhaps even love, not this sterile transaction. But what choice did she have? "I need to meet him," Eleanor said suddenly. "Before I agree, I need to meet the Duke." Pembroke's eyebrows rose. "That is highly irregular. The contract requires my signature," Eleanor interrupted, with a firmness that surprised even herself, "which I will not provide until I have met the man I'm meant to marry, arrangement or not. I may be desperate, Mr. Pembroke, but I am not cattle to be sold sight unseen." For the first time, something like respect flickered in the solicitor's eyes. He inclined his head. "Very well. I will arrange a meeting. The Duke is currently in residence at Ashford House. Would tomorrow afternoon suit?" Tomorrow. So soon. Eleanor's heart lurched, but she nodded. Tomorrow. That evening, as Eleanor lay in her bed, the same bed she had slept in since childhood, the bed that might soon belong to strangers, she stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine her future. A year of pretense, a year of living with a cold, distant Duke who wanted nothing from her but her presence. And then, freedom, supposedly, financial security, the ability to help her family without the crushing weight of obligation, but at what cost to her soul? She thought of the stories her governess had read to her as a child, tales of knights and ladies, of love conquering all obstacles. How naive those stories seemed now, how childish. Real life demanded sacrifice. Real life demanded that one set aside romantic notions and face hard truths. Lady Eleanor Everhart, daughter of a disgraced earl, had run out of choices. The Duke of Ashford, it seemed, was her only hope. The following afternoon arrived with merciless speed. Eleanor, dressed with care in her most conservative gown, a deep burgundy silk that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, but remained elegant. Her lady's maid, Davies, arranged her dark auburn hair in a simple chignon, pinning it securely with the pearl combs that had belonged to her grandmother. "You look beautiful, my lady," Davies said softly, her eyes suspiciously bright. The servants knew, of course. Servants always knew. "I look desperate," Eleanor replied with brutal honesty, then softened. "But thank you, Davies." The journey to Ashford House in Mayfair took 40 minutes through London's perpetually congested streets. Eleanor sat rigid in the hired carriage, her mother beside her offering useless platitudes about propriety and duty. Thomas had remained at their rented lodgings, too proud to witness his sister's humiliation. Ashford House was imposing, a massive Georgian edifice of pale stone that spoke of centuries of wealth and power. The kind of house that made one feel small and insignificant merely by existing. A liveried footman handed them down from the carriage with mechanical courtesy, and they were ushered into an entrance hall of breathtaking opulence, marble floors, soaring ceilings, portraits of stern-faced Ashfords glaring down at visitors with aristocratic disdain. "Her ladyship and Lady Eleanor Everhart," the butler announced, leading them into a drawing-room decorated in shades of cream and gold. "His Grace will join you presently." And then they waited. 5 minutes. 10. Eleanor's nerves stretched tighter with each passing second. She studied the room, noting the Italian paintings, the French furnishings, the subtle display of wealth that required no ostentation because it was so absolute. Finally, she heard footsteps, measured, unhurried, approaching along the marble corridor. The door opened. Alexander Colton, Duke of Ashford, entered the room, and Eleanor's breath caught despite herself. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too angular, too stern, all sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from granite. His hair was dark, almost black, ruthlessly controlled. His eyes were an unusual shade of grey, like storm clouds before rain, and they assessed her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as though he could see every desperate thought, every fearful calculation running through her mind. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. He wore a perfectly tailored coat of charcoal wool, his cravat tied with mathematical precision. Every inch, the aristocratic duke. But there was something else, something in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, like a soldier, like someone who had seen and done things that haunted him. "Lady Everhart, Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice deep and cultured, betraying no emotion whatsoever. He bowed with exact courtesy. "Thank you for coming," as though they had a choice, as though this was a social call rather than a negotiation for her future. Eleanor rose and curtsied, her mother doing likewise. When she straightened, she found the Duke's grey eyes fixed on her face with disconcerting focus. "Mr. Pembroke has explained the situation?" he asked directly, dispensing with pleasantries. "He has," Eleanor replied, pleased that her voice remained steady, "though I confess I find the entire arrangement rather distasteful," the Duke supplied, and there might have been the ghost of humour in his tone. "I assure you, Lady Eleanor, the feeling is mutual. I have no more desire to marry than you do. However, my uncle's will has placed us both in untenable positions. You need financial security. I need a wife to prevent my wastrel cousin from destroying everything my family has built over centuries. It seems we can be of mutual benefit." His bluntness was almost refreshing after Pembroke's careful circumlocutions. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "And after the year, after your inheritance is secure, you will be free," the Duke said simply, "with a settlement that will ensure you never know financial worry again. £50,000, a townhouse in Bath, and an allowance of £3,000 per annum. Generous enough to live very comfortably, to provide for your family, to perhaps even remarry if you wish, though you would retain the title of Duchess. £50,000. Eleanor's mind reeled. It was more money than she had ever imagined possessing. More than enough to not only pay her father's debts, but to secure her family's future permanently. "And during the year," she asked, "what exactly would you require of me?" The Duke's expression remained impassive. "Your presence at necessary social functions, your signature on the marriage certificate, your cooperation in maintaining the appearance of a genuine union. Beyond that, you would have your own apartments, your own life. I would make no demands upon you of a personal nature." He said it so clinically, so matter-of-factly, that it took Eleanor a moment to understand his meaning. When she did, she felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was promising that the marriage would remain unconsummated, that he would never exercise what the law termed his conjugal rights. It should have been a relief. It was a relief. And yet, something in Eleanor bristled at the cold dismissal, at being so thoroughly categorized as undesirable. "I see," she said quietly. "A business arrangement in every sense." "Precisely," the Duke agreed. He paused, then added with unexpected consideration, "I understand this is not what you would have chosen for yourself, Lady Eleanor, but I give you my word as a gentleman that you will be treated with complete respect. You will want for nothing material, and your privacy will be sacrosanct." Eleanor looked at this stern, remote man who was offering her salvation at the cost of a year of her life. She thought of her mother's frightened eyes, of Thomas's barely concealed desperation, of Thornbury Manor slipping through their fingers like water. "Very well," she said, the words seeming to come from someone else, someone braver and more resigned. "I accept your terms, Your Grace." Something flickered in the Duke's grey eyes. Relief? Respect? She couldn't tell. "Then we have an accord," he said. He moved to a side table, poured 3 glasses of sherry with practiced ease, and handed one to Eleanor and one to her mother. "To pragmatism," he said, raising his glass with ironic courtesy, "and to making the best of impossible situations." Eleanor raised her glass, the crystal cold against her palm, and drank. The sherry burned her throat, but it was nothing compared to the cold certainty settling in her chest. In 3 weeks, she would become the Duchess of Ashford. In 1 year, she would be free, and in between, she would live a careful, constructed lie. As she left Ashford House that afternoon, Eleanor told herself she was doing the right thing, the only thing. She told herself that duty and sacrifice were noble virtues, that love and romance were luxuries she could not afford. She told herself many things, but she could not quite silence the small voice in her heart that whispered, "What have I done?" The wedding was scheduled for the 23rd of October, a date chosen for its proximity to the Duke's 30th birthday in November, rather than for any sentimental significance. The ceremony would take place at St. George's Church, Hanover Square, the fashionable church of Mayfair society, where marriages of the aristocracy were solemnized with appropriate pomp and witnessed by those whose opinions mattered in the rarefied world of the ton. Eleanor spent the 3 weeks before her wedding in a state of surreal detachment, as though she were watching events unfold from a great distance. There were fittings for her wedding gown, a confection of ivory silk and Belgian lace that cost more than her family had spent on clothing in the past 3 years. There were meetings with the Duke's solicitor to finalize the marriage contracts, endless documents to sign, financial arrangements to be made. The Duke himself remained conspicuously absent from these preparations, conducting all business through intermediaries. She saw him only once more before the wedding day, at a brief, awkward dinner at Ashford House, where they sat at opposite ends of a table meant to seat 20 and made stilted conversation about nothing of consequence. He asked after her accommodations at the rented lodgings he had discreetly arranged for her family. She inquired politely about his parliamentary responsibilities. They were 2 strangers performing a script, and when the evening ended, Eleanor felt more alone than ever. Her mother, determined to find silver linings, chattered endlessly about Eleanor's elevated position. "A duchess," she would say, her eyes bright with desperate optimism. "My daughter, A duchess. No one can look down upon us now. But Eleanor heard what went unspoken. Even if the marriage is a farce, even if you're essentially a paid companion with a grander title, Thomas, to his credit, asked her directly if this was truly what she wanted. They were alone in the cramped sitting room of their temporary lodgings, the autumn rain creating a melancholy soundtrack beyond the windows. "Does it matter what I want?" Eleanor replied quietly, staring at her hands. "This is what must be done." "You could refuse," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We could find another way. I could—" "You could what?" Eleanor interrupted gently. "You're 17, Thomas. You have no prospects, no money, no connections that aren't tainted by father's failures. And she smiled sadly. "I'm 24, past the first bloom of youth, with no dowry and a family scandal hanging over me like a cloud. The Duke's offer is more than generous. It's a miracle. It's a cage," Thomas said fiercely. "A gilded cage, perhaps, but still a cage." Eleanor couldn't argue with that. So instead she hugged her brother tightly and told him it would be all right, knowing he didn't believe her any more than she believed herself. The morning of October 23rd dawned grey and cold, with a persistent drizzle that seemed quintessentially English. Eleanor woke in the unfamiliar bedroom of Ashford House, where she had been installed the night before in accordance with tradition. Her wedding gown hung on the wardrobe like a ghost, a beautiful, expensive ghost. Davies helped her dress with painstaking care, each button and hook a small step toward the irrevocable. The gown fit perfectly, transforming Eleanor into someone she barely recognized. A bride, radiant and lovely, prepared to make the most important commitment of her life. The hypocrisy of it made her want to laugh or cry. She wasn't sure which. "You look like a princess, my lady," Davies whispered, tears streaking her worn face. "His Grace is a fortunate man." Eleanor said nothing. She knew the truth. The Duke felt no such fortune. This was a transaction, nothing more, nothing less. The carriage ride to St. George's was mercifully brief. Eleanor sat beside her mother, who kept patting her hand and murmuring encouragements that bounced off Eleanor's carefully constructed composure without leaving a mark. The church loomed before them, its elegant facade imposing and absolute. Inside, the pews were filled with spectators, members of society come to witness the unlikely marriage of the reclusive Duke of Ashford to the daughter of a disgraced earl. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, whispering behind gloved hands and raised fans. She lifted her chin and moved forward with as much grace as she could muster. At the altar, the Duke waited. He wore full mourning dress, impeccably tailored, his dark hair brushed back from his face, his expression unreadable. When Eleanor reached his side, he offered his arm with mechanical courtesy. She placed her gloved hand upon it and felt the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric, the only real thing in this elaborate charade. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity. The elderly bishop droned through the liturgy, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. Eleanor responded when required, her voice surprisingly steady. She heard the Duke's deep tones beside her, equally controlled, equally empty of emotion. "Do you, Alexander Charles Edward Colton, Duke of Ashford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," the Duke said, and his voice gave away nothing. "Do you, Eleanor Catherine Everhart, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey, till death do you part?" Eleanor hesitated for the barest fraction of a second. This was the moment. Her last chance to refuse, to run, to choose poverty and dignity over wealth and pretense. But she thought of her mother, of Thomas, of Thornbury Manor with its ghosts and memories. "I do," she whispered. The ring, a magnificent band of diamonds and sapphires that had belonged to generations of Ashford duchesses, slid onto her finger with cold finality. The Duke's hands were steady as he performed the gesture, betraying no tremor of emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the bishop declared with satisfaction. "You may kiss the bride." The Duke turned to Eleanor, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. She saw something flicker in his grey eyes, reluctance, resignation. Then he leaned down, his movements deliberate and controlled, and pressed his lips to hers in the briefest possible contact, a mere formality to satisfy convention. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. His lips were warm, firm, and completely impersonal. Then he straightened, offered his arm once more, and turned to face the congregation. They were married. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ashford House was an elaborate affair, executed with the Duke's characteristic precision. 200 guests filled the grand ballroom, consuming champagne and delicacies prepared by French chefs, while an orchestra played tasteful selections. Eleanor moved through it all in a daze, accepting congratulations from people whose names she would never remember, playing the role of blushing bride with enough competence to satisfy appearances. The Duke remained at her side throughout, the picture of solicitous attention. To the casual observer, they must have appeared the perfect couple. He stern but attentive, she lovely and demure. No one could have guessed that they had barely spoken a dozen words to each other beyond the wedding vows. Late in the afternoon, as the celebration finally began to wind down, Eleanor found herself cornered in an alcove by a woman she hadn't noticed among the guests. She was perhaps 30, with artfully arranged blonde curls and a gown of emerald silk that was just slightly too revealing, too ostentatious for the occasion. "Lady Ashford," the woman said, her smile not quite reaching her calculating blue eyes. "Or should I say, Your Grace? How quickly fortunes change." Eleanor bristled at the woman's tone, but kept her expression neutral. "You have me at a disadvantage, madam. I'm afraid I don't know your name." "Lady Sophronia Winthrop," the woman replied, executing a mocking curtsy, "though I doubt Alexander has mentioned me. We are old acquaintances." The way she said acquaintances made Eleanor's skin prickle with unease. There was intimacy in that word, a suggestion of things Eleanor had no right to care about, but found herself caring about nonetheless. "How lovely," Eleanor said with cold politeness. "I do hope you've enjoyed the wedding." "Oh, immensely," Lady Sophronia replied, her smile sharpening, "though I must confess surprise. I had always assumed when Alexander finally married, it would be to someone from his own circle, someone who understood his world, his needs. Not—" She paused delicately, her eyes travelling over Eleanor's gown with barely concealed disdain. "Not someone quite so provincial." The insult, delivered with such honeyed venom, landed with precision. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but before she could formulate a response, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Lady Sophronia," the Duke said, appearing at Eleanor's side with surprising stealth. His tone was glacial. "How kind of you to attend. I believe your carriage has been called." It was a dismissal, absolute and unmistakable. Lady Sophronia's smile faltered, then hardened. She curtsied to the Duke, shot Eleanor one final venomous look, and swept away in a rustle of emerald silk. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly, "though I assure you I can handle such unpleasantness myself." The Duke regarded her with those unreadable grey eyes. "I'm certain you can," he said. "But you are now Duchess of Ashford, and you will be treated with the respect that title commands." Lady Sophronia has always struggled with boundaries. There was something in his tone, a hint of history Eleanor didn't understand, and probably had no right to probe. She decided not to ask. The guests finally departed as dusk settled over London, leaving Ashford House suddenly, oppressively quiet. The servants moved efficiently through the ballroom, clearing away the detritus of celebration. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall, suddenly uncertain of what came next. The Duke appeared at the top of the grand staircase, having changed from his formal attire into a simple but elegant coat and trousers. He descended with measured steps. "Your apartments are prepared," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, will show you the way. You have a bedroom, sitting room and dressing room on the second floor. My rooms are in the opposite wing. You need not fear any intrusion." He said it so clinically, as though they were discussing the arrangement of furniture rather than the non-existent intimacy of their wedding night. Eleanor felt a confused mixture of relief and something that felt uncomfortably like disappointment. "Thank you," she managed. "That's very considerate." "It's the arrangement we agreed upon," the Duke replied. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I realize today has been trying. You conducted yourself admirably. Society will accept you in time as my Duchess." It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment he had offered. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good night, Eleanor," the Duke said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange in his deep voice, too intimate for the distance between them. "Good night, Your Grace," she replied. "Alexander," he corrected quietly. "When we're alone, you may call me Alexander." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving Eleanor alone in the grand entrance hall of a house that was now hers, but felt nothing like home. Mrs. Henshaw, a formidable woman in severe black, appeared as if summoned by magic. "This way, Your Grace," she said, her tone respectful but distant. Eleanor followed her up the sweeping staircase and down a long corridor hung with portraits of Colton ancestors. Her apartments, when Mrs. Henshaw finally opened the doors, were stunning, decorated in shades of rose and cream, with furnishings that were both elegant and comfortable. A fire burned cheerfully in the grate. Through an open door, Eleanor could see a canopied bed draped in silk, her wedding night bed, empty save for herself. "Will Your Grace require anything else?" Mrs. Henshaw inquired. "No, thank you," Eleanor replied. "That will be all." The housekeeper curtsied and departed, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. Eleanor stood in the center of her beautiful, lonely sitting room and felt the weight of everything that had happened crash over her like a wave. She was married. She was a duchess. She was trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. She moved to the window and looked out over the dark garden below. Somewhere in this vast house, Alexander Colton sat in his own apartments, as alone as she was. Two strangers bound by law and contract, by desperation and duty, for better or worse, till death or divorce parted them. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass, and finally allowed herself to cry. The first weeks of Eleanor's marriage passed in a strange, liminal state, neither comfortable nor entirely unbearable. She and Alexander, she found herself thinking of him by his given name now, though she still addressed him formally in company, existed in a state of careful courtesy, like diplomats from warring nations forced to share accommodations during peace negotiations. They breakfasted together each morning in the smaller dining room, a concession to the appearance of marital harmony. Alexander would read the Times while consuming eggs and kippers with methodical efficiency. Eleanor would nibble toast and pretend to peruse the society pages, acutely aware of the silence between them, broken only by the rustle of newsprint and the clink of silverware. Occasionally, he would ask about her plans for the day. Occasionally, she would inquire about his parliamentary commitments or business matters. The conversations were brief, superficial, and utterly devoid of genuine connection. In the afternoons, Eleanor was left to her own devices. She explored Ashford House room by room, discovering libraries filled with books in 6 languages, a music room with a pianoforte that hadn't been played in years, galleries hung with masterpieces by Italian and Dutch painters. It was a house of staggering wealth and equally staggering emptiness. No warmth, no laughter, no sign that people actually lived here rather than merely existing. The servants were efficient and respectful, but distant. Eleanor sensed they were waiting to see what kind of duchess she would be, a tyrant, a fool, or something in between. She tried to be kind without being weak, to learn the intricate hierarchies and protocols of managing a ducal household without betraying her own inexperience. It was exhausting. Society demanded their presence at various functions, dinners, balls, the opera. Alexander would inform her of these obligations with the same tone one might use to schedule a dentist appointment. They would attend together, playing their roles with practiced precision. He, the attentive husband, ensuring she had champagne, introducing her to important personages. She, the gracious duchess, smiling until her face ached, making conversation about nothing with people who assessed her every word and gesture. Behind their backs, the whispers followed. Such an odd match. But of course he needed a wife quickly, the inheritance, shame about her family. She's lovely enough, I suppose, but can she handle being a duchess? Eleanor heard the whispers and learned to ignore them, mostly. It was Lady Sophronia Winthrop, however, who proved the most persistent thorn. She appeared at nearly every social function Eleanor and Alexander attended, always perfectly coiffed, always in gowns that pushed the boundaries of propriety, always finding excuses to engage Alexander in conversation while looking through Eleanor as though she were made of glass. At a ball at Devonshire House 3 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor watched from across the room as Lady Sophronia laughed at something Alexander said, her gloved hand resting on his arm with familiar intimacy. Something hot and unpleasant twisted in Eleanor's chest. Not jealousy, surely, because one couldn't be jealous over a husband in name only, a man who treated her with the same distant courtesy he might show a respectable stranger. Poisonous creature, isn't she? Eleanor startled at the voice beside her. She turned to find a woman perhaps 60 years old, dressed in elegant but understated grey silk, regarding her with shrewd, intelligent eyes. Her face was lined but beautiful, her silver hair arranged in a style that was fashionable 20 years prior, but suited her perfectly. "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor managed. "Lady Sophronia Winthrop," the woman clarified, nodding toward the emerald-clad blonde, still monopolizing Alexander's attention. "Poisonous. Has been since she was a girl. I'm Lady Pemberton, by the way, Agatha Pemberton. Alexander's godmother, though the dear boy seems to have forgotten I exist since returning from the continent." Eleanor curtsied, surprised and oddly pleased. "Your Grace," she said. "I mean, Lady Pemberton. I'm Eleanor." "Duchess of Ashford, I know," Lady Pemberton interrupted with a wave of her hand, "and married to my godson in circumstances that are entirely too mysterious for my liking. The boy marries in haste, to a girl no one in society knows, and then parades her about like a prize mare while barely speaking to her. What, precisely, is happening in that household?" The directness was so unexpected, so refreshing after weeks of careful social performances, that Eleanor found herself laughing, the first genuine laugh since her wedding day. "You're very perceptive, Lady Pemberton," she said carefully. "I'm old, girl, and I've lived through 3 kings and more scandals than you've had hot dinners. I know a marriage of convenience when I see one." Agatha's eyes, a faded but still sharp blue, assessed Eleanor with the same directness. "The question is, why? Alexander's no fool. He could have had his pick of desperate mama's daughters. Why you?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something in Lady Pemberton's expression, a kind of world-weary understanding, made her want to trust this woman. "My family was facing ruin," she said quietly. "The Duke needed a wife to satisfy his uncle's will. It was mutually beneficial." "Mutually beneficial," Agatha repeated with a snort. "What bloodless language! You mean you sold yourself to save your family, and he bought himself a bride to prevent his wastrel cousin from inheriting? How very modern and depressing." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but Agatha's hand shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't you dare be ashamed." the older woman said fiercely. "You did what you had to do. That takes courage. What I want to know is, what happens now? Do you intend to spend your year of servitude hiding in corners at balls, watching that harpy Sophronia sink her claws into Alexander while you play the martyred wife?" "It's not," Eleanor began, then stopped. "Because wasn't that exactly what she was doing? Alexander and I have an agreement. After a suitable period, we'll separate. I'll have my independence, and he'll have his inheritance. There's no point in pretending otherwise." Agatha studied her for a long moment. "You're intelligent," he said finally. "I can see it in your eyes. And you've got a spine, though you're not quite sure how to use it yet. Alexander chose better than he knows." She paused, then added with calculated casualness, "Tell me, have you been introduced to London society properly? Beyond these dreadful balls where everyone whispers and no one says anything of substance?" "Not really," Eleanor admitted. "I know very few people in London." "Ridiculous," Agatha declared. "You're a duchess now, girl. You need allies, friends, a proper social circle that isn't composed entirely of vipers and social climbers. Tomorrow afternoon, you'll come to tea at my house. I'm hosting a salon, a real salon, mind you, not one of those insipid affairs where ladies discuss embroidery and gentlemen talk politics in another room. Writers, artists, reformers, people who think. You'll fit right in." Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the speed of Agatha's decree. That's very kind, but I should ask Alexander." "Ask Alexander nothing," Agatha interrupted. "You're a grown woman and a duchess besides. You don't need his permission to have tea with your husband's godmother. 3 o'clock, Berkeley Square, number 17. Don't be late." Before Eleanor could respond, Agatha had swept away, leaving Eleanor feeling as though she'd just been caught in a particularly benevolent whirlwind. She looked across the ballroom again and found Alexander's eyes on her, a question in his expression. Lady Sophronia still stood at his side, but his attention was fixed on Eleanor. She raised her chin and smiled, a real smile, not the practiced social expression she'd been wearing for weeks. Something flickered in Alexander's grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Then he nodded slightly and turned his attention back to whatever Lady Sophronia was saying. The following afternoon, Eleanor dressed carefully in a walking dress of deep blue wool and took a carriage to Berkeley Square. Agatha's townhouse was elegant but lived in, filled with comfortable furniture, overflowing bookshelves, and the subtle scent of lemon oil and fresh flowers. The salon was already in progress when Eleanor arrived. The drawing-room buzzed with conversation, not the stilted small talk of society gatherings, but genuine, passionate debate. There were perhaps 20 people present, men and women mingling freely, some seated, others standing in animated clusters. "Ah, Your Grace," Agatha called out, spotting Eleanor immediately. "Everyone, this is the Duchess of Ashford, Eleanor Colton. Eleanor, this is everyone." A ripple of laughter greeted this irreverent introduction. Eleanor found herself relaxing almost immediately. Over the next 2 hours, she met an extraordinary array of people. Mrs. Harriet Blackwood, a novelist who wrote under a male pseudonym, Dr. Elias Carmichael, a physician advocating for improved conditions in London's hospitals, Miss Josephine Hartley, an unmarried woman of independent means who had travelled extensively through India and Egypt, Mr. Tobias Green, a journalist investigating factory conditions, and at least a dozen others, each more interesting than anyone Eleanor had met in weeks of society functions. They discussed everything: politics, literature, social reform, the morality of empire, the rights of women, the future of industry. Eleanor, initially hesitant to speak, found herself drawn into the conversations. When she ventured an opinion about the need for better education for the poor, Mrs. Blackwood seized upon it enthusiastically, and soon they were deep in discussion about literacy rates and access to knowledge. "You've got a good mind, Doctor," Carmichael said approvingly, when Eleanor articulately defended her position that hospitals should be open to all, regardless of ability to pay. Too many of your class think charity is about maintaining their own status rather than genuinely helping people. I believe, Eleanor said carefully, that privilege comes with responsibility. If one has advantages, wealth, education, position, one has an obligation to use them for the benefit of others, not merely for self-aggrandizement. Spoken like a woman who's known hardship, Agatha observed shrewdly. Comfort breeds complacency. Adversity breeds wisdom, if one allows it. As the afternoon drew to a close and guests began to depart, Agatha drew Eleanor aside. "You'll come again next week," she said, a statement, not a question, "and you'll bring Alexander, though God knows he'll resist. The boy has become far too serious. He needs to remember there's more to life than duty and inheritance." "I'm not sure Alexander would enjoy this sort of gathering," Eleanor said hesitantly. "He seems to prefer solitude to company." "What he prefers and what he needs are two different things," Agatha replied, "as are what you've resigned yourself to and what you deserve." She fixed Eleanor with a penetrating look. "This arrangement of yours, this business-like marriage, it's safe, isn't it? No risk of disappointment if you expect nothing, no heartbreak if there's no heart involved. But what a cold, lonely way to live for both of you." Eleanor felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest. "We agreed—" "I know what you agreed," Agatha interrupted gently. "I'm suggesting that agreements can evolve, if both parties are willing to be brave. Alexander has spent a decade building walls around himself. You've spent your entire life meeting others' expectations at the expense of your own desires. Perhaps this marriage, unconventional as it is, could be an opportunity for you both to become something more than your circumstances." Eleanor wanted to dismiss the words, to retreat into the safe distance she and Alexander had established, but something in Agatha's expression, hope mixed with challenge, made her pause. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Do more than think," Agatha urged. "Act. You're a duchess now, my dear. You have power, even if you haven't realized it yet. Use it." That evening, Eleanor returned to Ashford House feeling strangely energized. She found Alexander in the library, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, his dark head bent over paperwork. "You had a pleasant afternoon?" he asked without looking up, his pen continuing its measured scratch across paper. "I did," Eleanor replied. She hesitated, then added, "Your godmother is a remarkable woman. She invited me to her salon." That made Alexander look up, surprise evident in his expression. "Aunt Agatha contacted you?" "She attended the Devonshire ball last night," Eleanor explained. "We spoke, and she invited me to tea this afternoon. There was a gathering, writers, reformers, intellectuals. It was—" she searched for the right word. "Invigorating." Something complicated crossed Alexander's face. "Aunt Agatha has always had a talent for collecting interesting people. I'm glad she's taken an interest in you. God knows she despaired of me years ago." "She asked me to bring you next week," Eleanor said, watching his reaction carefully. Alexander's expression closed immediately, the walls slamming back into place. "I'm far too busy with parliamentary matters and estate business to attend afternoon salons." "Of course," Eleanor said quietly. "I understand." But as she left the library, she thought about Agatha's words. Agreements can evolve, and she wondered if Alexander's walls were as impenetrable as he wanted her to believe. Perhaps, she thought with the first stirring of something that felt dangerously like hope, there was more to this marriage than mutual convenience. Perhaps there could be connection, understanding, even friendship. It was a small thought, a dangerous thought, but it took root in Eleanor's heart nonetheless, growing despite every rational reason to let it wither and die. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's life transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Agatha's salon became a weekly refuge, a place where she was valued for her mind rather than judged by her circumstances. She formed genuine friendships with Harriet Blackwood, whose wit and literary observations delighted her, with Dr. Carmichael, whose passionate advocacy for medical reform inspired her, with Josephine Hartley, whose independent spirit challenged Eleanor's own assumptions about what was possible for women. But more than the friendships, it was the sense of purpose that awakened something in Eleanor. In conversations about social reform, education, and justice, she discovered opinions she hadn't known she possessed. Passions she hadn't realized lay dormant beneath years of dutiful conformity to societal expectations. At Agatha's encouragement, Eleanor began visiting Dr. Carmichael's hospital in Southwark, where London's poor sought medical care in conditions that shocked her sensibilities. The overcrowding, the lack of basic supplies, the desperation, it was a world away from Mayfair's elegant townhouses and comfortable drawing rooms. "This is unconscionable," Eleanor said one afternoon, watching as Dr. Carmichael treated a child's infected wound with supplies so meagre as to be nearly useless. "Why doesn't the government provide funding?" "Because the government is composed of men who never set foot in places like this, Doctor," Carmichael replied, his hands gentle despite his bitter words. "To them, the poor are abstractions, problems to be debated in Parliament, not human beings suffering and dying for want of basic care. Then someone must make them see," Eleanor said with sudden fierce conviction. "Someone must advocate so loudly, so persistently that they cannot ignore the truth." Dr. Carmichael looked at her with respect. "That someone could be you, Your Grace. A duchess has a platform, influence, if you chose to use it." The idea took root. Eleanor began researching hospital conditions, compiling statistics, interviewing patients and medical staff. She wrote letters to members of Parliament, polite but insistent missives detailing the urgent need for reform. Most went unanswered. A few generated perfunctory responses promising vague future attention. But Eleanor persisted. At home, her relationship with Alexander remained cordial but distant. He noticed her increased absences. She was no longer simply decorating the drawing room or paying pointless social calls, but said nothing. They still breakfasted together in companionable silence. They still attended necessary social functions, presenting the image of a respectable, if not passionate, ducal couple. But there was a new tension now, an awareness Eleanor couldn't quite name. She found herself watching Alexander when he wasn't looking, noticing things she hadn't before, the way he rubbed his temples when dealing with particularly frustrating correspondence, suggesting persistent headaches, the rare, almost reluctant smile that occasionally softened his stern features when something genuinely amused him, the careful consideration he gave to his tenants' concerns, reviewing rents and living conditions with more compassion than most aristocrats would bother displaying. He was not, she realized, the cold, unfeeling man he presented to the world. He was guarded, certainly, self-contained, and intensely private. But there were depths beneath that controlled surface, complexities she found herself wanting to understand. The realization unsettled her. This was meant to be a business arrangement. Understanding him, caring about his inner life, that wasn't part of their agreement. The crisis came on a rain-soaked November evening, 6 weeks into their marriage. Eleanor returned from the Southwark hospital later than usual, her dress hem-muddy, her hair escaping its pins, exhausted but energized by a breakthrough. Dr. Carmichael had secured a commitment from a wealthy merchant to donate funds for new medical supplies. She entered Ashford House through the servants' entrance, not wanting the footman to see her dishevelled state, and nearly collided with Alexander in the corridor leading to the main house. He stood motionless, clearly having been waiting. His expression was thunderous. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice tight, with what sounded like fury. "It's past 8 o'clock. No one knew your whereabouts. The carriage driver reported taking you to Southwark, of all godforsaken places." "I was at Dr. Carmichael's hospital," Eleanor replied, startled by his vehemence, "working on my hospital reform project. I sent word I would be late." "Southwark," Alexander interrupted, his grey eyes blazing with an emotion Eleanor couldn't identify. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that area is? The diseases, the crime, the—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to wrestle with himself. "You're a duchess. You cannot simply wander about London's worst neighbourhoods like some sort of charity worker." Eleanor felt her own temper, usually so carefully controlled, flare to life. "I am a charity worker," she shot back. "Or rather, I'm trying to be something more than a decorative ornament in your perfectly managed household. You made it clear our marriage was in name only, that I could live my own life. Well, this is my life, Alexander. This work matters to me." "And what matters to me," Alexander said, his voice dropping to something low and intense, "is ensuring you don't contract cholera or typhus or get attacked in some filthy alley because you're too stubborn to recognize danger." "Why?" The question burst from Eleanor before she could stop it. "Why do you care? According to our arrangement, I'm merely a temporary inconvenience, a means to secure your inheritance. Why should it matter to you what I do or where I go?" The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander stared at her, something raw and unguarded flashing across his face before he could suppress it. "Because," he said finally, the words seeming dragged from some deep, unwilling place, "despite my best efforts, despite all rational sense, I find that it matters. Your safety matters. Your well-being matters. You matter." The confession hung in the air between them, shocking in its honesty. Eleanor felt her breath catch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Alexander," she whispered, uncertain of what she was asking. He seemed to realize what he'd revealed. The walls slammed back into place immediately. "Forgive me," he said, his voice reverting to its usual controlled courtesy. "I overstepped. Your activities are, of course, your own concern. I merely ask that you take proper precautions, bring footmen for protection, ensure the coachman knows your location. I would not wish to explain to your family that I had allowed harm to befall you." The moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by formal propriety. But Eleanor had seen behind the mask, however briefly, and she couldn't unsee it. "I'll be more careful," she said quietly. "I promise." Alexander nodded stiffly and turned to leave, but Eleanor found herself speaking again, her voice soft but determined. "For what it's worth," she said, "you matter too. To me. You're not just a convenient solution to my family's financial crisis. She searched for words. "You're more than I expected, more than our arrangement suggested." Alexander froze, his back still to her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, without turning around, he spoke so quietly she almost didn't hear. "Good night, Eleanor." And he walked away, leaving Eleanor alone in the corridor, her heart racing. Everything she'd believed about their marriage suddenly, irrevocably changed. The following week, Agatha hosted her usual salon. This time, however, Eleanor arrived to find Alexander already present, looking distinctly uncomfortable among the artists and reformers, but present nonetheless. Agatha caught Eleanor's eye and winked, clearly taking credit for this development. Alexander spent the afternoon in conversation with Mr. Green, the journalist, discussing factory conditions and workers' rights with an engagement Eleanor had never witnessed in him before. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute, his observations were thoughtful and informed by his parliamentary experience. After the gathering ended and most guests had departed, the three of them, Eleanor, Alexander, and Agatha, remained in the drawing room, sipping sherry in comfortable silence. "You did well today, boy," Agatha said to Alexander. "Didn't even look like someone was pulling your teeth." Alexander's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Your gatherings are less painful than I remembered, Aunt Agatha." "That's because you've changed," Agatha replied shrewdly. "Or perhaps you're allowing yourself to be who you actually are, rather than who you think a duke should be." She looked between Alexander and Eleanor with satisfaction. "You make a good team. Both of you have good minds and kind hearts, when you allow them to show." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at the words. Alexander caught her eye, and for once his expression was unguarded, uncertain, hopeful, almost shy. "Eleanor has been advocating for hospital reform," he said to Agatha, though his eyes remained on Eleanor. "Writing to Parliament, organizing donations, working with Dr. Carmichael. It's admirable work." It was perhaps the first compliment he'd paid her directly. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with pleased surprise. "Then you should support her," Agatha said bluntly. "Use your position, your connections. A duke's endorsement carries weight, particularly in Parliament. Stop hiding in your ledgers and do something meaningful with your privilege." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "I've been withdrawn, focused on duties and obligations while ignoring opportunities to effect real change." He turned to Eleanor. "If you'd allow me, I'd like to help with your hospital project. I have contacts in Parliament, influence I could leverage on behalf of medical reform." Eleanor felt something blossom in her chest, hope, gratitude, and something deeper, more dangerous. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "Thank you." And there, in Agatha's drawing room, something fundamental shifted between them. Not the dramatic transformation of the novels Eleanor had read as a girl, but something quieter and perhaps more real. A genuine partnership beginning to form from the ruins of their convenient arrangement. Over the following weeks, they worked together on the hospital reform project. Alexander arranged meetings with influential parliamentarians. Eleanor compiled evidence and drafted proposals. They spent evenings in the library at Ashford House, sitting across from each other at the massive desk, debating strategy and sharing observations. Slowly, tentatively, they began to talk about more than just their shared work. Alexander spoke of his years in diplomatic service, the loneliness and constant vigilance required, the way it had taught him to trust no one and reveal nothing. Eleanor shared her grief over her father's death, the shame of their family's disgrace, the burden of feeling responsible for her mother and brother's well-being. "I didn't want this marriage," Alexander confessed one evening, staring into the library fire. "I resented my uncle's will, the manipulation, the forced choice. When Pembroke suggested a marriage of convenience, it seemed the least awful option. No expectations, no vulnerability, no risk of—" He paused. "No risk of what?" Eleanor prompted gently. "Disappointment," Alexander finished quietly. "In myself, in my wife, in the institution of marriage itself. My parents' marriage was difficult, cold. My father was autocratic and demanding. My mother was miserable. I swore I would never inflict that on anyone." "So you chose isolation instead?" Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "Better to be alone than to risk creating the same unhappiness." "Yes," Alexander agreed. "But I'm beginning to think—" He turned to look at her, his grey eyes more open than she'd ever seen them. "I'm beginning to think that isolation is its own form of unhappiness, and that perhaps, with the right person, partnership doesn't have to mean misery." Eleanor's heart hammered. "Alexander, I know our arrangement," he interrupted quickly. "I know we agreed to separate after a year. I'll honor that if it's what you still want. But I find myself hoping—" He stopped, struggling visibly with the admission. "I find myself hoping you might consider making this marriage real. Not for convenience or obligation, but because we've built something worth preserving." The words hung in the air, a question and a hope and a risk all wrapped together. Eleanor thought about the past 2 months, the slow unfolding of understanding, the partnership forming, the way her heart lightened when Alexander smiled, the way she had come to anticipate their conversations, value his opinions, crave his company. She thought about the agreement they'd made, the safe, predictable ending it promised, and she realized she no longer wanted safety. She wanted this, the uncertainty, the risk, the possibility of something real. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Very much." Alexander's expression transformed relief and joy, breaking through his careful control like sunlight through clouds. He stood, crossed to where Eleanor sat, and took her hands in his. "Then we'll make this work," he said fiercely. "Not as a duty, not as an arrangement, but as partners, as husband and wife." He leaned down, and this time when his lips met hers, it was nothing like their perfunctory wedding kiss. This was warm, searching, filled with promise, and the tentative beginning of something neither of them had dared hope for. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor was breathless, her heart singing. "We have work to do," Alexander said with a smile. A real smile, transforming his stern face into something almost boyish. "Hospital reform won't advocate for itself." Eleanor laughed, the sound free and genuine. "Then we'd better get started." And they did, but not before Alexander kissed her again, sealing their new beginning with all the tenderness and hope neither had expected to find in their marriage of convenience. Winter descended upon London with characteristic grey persistence. But inside Ashford House, something warmer had taken root. Eleanor and Alexander's partnership deepened with each passing day, their marriage evolving from polite coexistence into genuine companionship. They still maintained separate bedrooms. Some proprieties took time to renegotiate, but the emotional distance that had defined their early weeks together had vanished entirely. Their hospital reform project gained momentum. Alexander leveraged his parliamentary connections with strategic precision, while Eleanor's passionate advocacy and meticulously compiled evidence swayed skeptical officials. Together, they secured commitments for increased funding to Southwark Hospital and 3 other facilities serving London's poor. Dr. Carmichael declared them a formidable force for good, praise that made Eleanor glow with satisfaction. But success bred jealousy, and nowhere was that more evident than in the continued presence of Lady Sophronia Winthrop. At a glittering ball at Carlton House in mid-December, Eleanor stood with a group of ladies discussing the latest novel, when she noticed Lady Sophronia making her way purposefully across the ballroom, not toward Alexander, as was her usual pattern, but directly toward Eleanor herself. "Duchess," Lady Sophronia said with a curtsy that managed to convey more mockery than respect. "How lovely to see you. I hear you've been quite busy with your little charity project. How quaint." The word dripped with condescension. Eleanor felt the other ladies in their circle shift uncomfortably, sensing confrontation. "Hospital reform is hardly quaint," Eleanor replied evenly. "Ensuring adequate medical care for all of London's citizens is a matter of basic human decency." "How very earnest," Lady Sophronia purred. "Tell me, do you ever worry that Alexander finds your earnestness tedious? He always preferred women with more sophistication, more worldly experience." The implication was clear and deeply insulting. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could formulate a cutting response, a familiar deep voice cut through the tension. "I find my wife's commitment to meaningful work both admirable and attractive," Alexander said, appearing at Eleanor's side with the timing of divine intervention. His arms slid around her waist with casual possessiveness, unlike idle gossip and baseless insinuation, which I find tedious in the extreme. Lady Sophronia's confident expression faltered. "Alexander, you merely sought to create discord," Alexander interrupted, his tone glacial. "A pattern I've tolerated far too long out of misguided politeness. But I'm no longer diplomatic service, Sophronia, and I needn't maintain cordial relations with those who insult my wife. I suggest you find other targets for your spite." It was a direct, devastating set-down, delivered with aristocratic precision. Lady Sophronia's face flushed scarlet, her lips pressing into a thin line. She curtsied stiffly and retreated, her composure shattered. The surrounding ladies barely suppressed their delight at witnessing Sophronia Winthrop humiliated. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude and something warmer, pride in Alexander, appreciation for his public defense, and a deepening affection that she was no longer trying to deny. "Thank you," she murmured as they moved away from the whispering crowd. "Though I was prepared to handle her myself." "I know you were," Alexander replied, his hand still warm at her waist. "But I wanted to make something abundantly clear to society. You are my Duchess in every sense, not a convenient arrangement, not a temporary necessity, but my true wife, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." Eleanor looked up at him, at the fierce protectiveness in his grey eyes, and felt something shift definitively in her heart. This wasn't fondness or gratitude or even partnership. This was love, Inconvenient, unexpected, irrevocable love. Alexander, she began, but he shook his head with a slight smile. Not here, he said quietly. Tonight, when we're home, there are things I need to say to you, things I've been too much a coward to voice. But tonight, Eleanor, I promise. The anticipation stretched through the remainder of the evening like a taut wire. Eleanor was barely aware of the conversations, the dancing, the endless social rituals. Her mind kept returning to Alexander's words, tonight. When they finally returned to Ashford House, well past midnight, the household was quiet, the servants abed. Alexander dismissed the single footman who had waited up for them, then turned to Eleanor with unmistakable intent. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. Eleanor took it without hesitation. He led her not to her apartments or his, but to the library, the room that had become their shared sanctuary, the place where their partnership had first truly formed. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. Alexander guided Eleanor to the settee before the hearth, then sat beside her, still holding her hand, as though afraid she might vanish. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "About Sophronia, about my past, about why I've been so guarded." "You don't have to explain," Eleanor said gently, but Alexander shook his head. "I do. You deserve honesty, especially now." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Sophronia and I were involved briefly years ago, before I entered diplomatic service. I was young, foolish, and she was beautiful and sophisticated, everything I thought I wanted. But she was also manipulative, unfaithful, and ultimately interested only in my title and wealth." Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for the younger Alexander, betrayed and disillusioned. "When I discovered her infidelity, in the most humiliating fashion possible, at a house party with half of society as witnesses, I ended the relationship immediately," Alexander continued. "But the experience left scars. I stopped trusting. I stopped believing that anyone could want me for myself rather than my position. I built walls, Eleanor, walls that have kept everyone at a distance for over a decade. Until now," Eleanor said softly. "Until you," Alexander agreed, turning to face her fully. His grey eyes were intense, vulnerable in a way she'd never witnessed. "You, who married me for practical reasons with no illusions of romance. You, who asked for nothing but honored your commitments with grace and intelligence. You who somehow saw past my walls and made me want to dismantle them brick by brick." He raised his free hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, the words simple and devastating. "I didn't plan to. I fought against it. But somewhere between your fierce advocacy for hospital patients and your brilliant arguments in the library late at night, between your kindness to my godmother and your courage in standing up to Sophronia, I fell irrevocably, completely in love with you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. "Alexander," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion, "I love you too. So much it frightens me sometimes. This wasn't what we planned, what we agreed." "To hell with our agreement," Alexander said with sudden fierce intensity. "I don't want a marriage of convenience. I don't want separate lives and a diplomatic separation after a year. I want you, Eleanor, forever, truly, as my wife in every sense, my partner, my confidant, my love." He slid from the settee to kneel before her, still holding her hand, his expression open and hopeful, and more vulnerable than she'd ever imagined the stern Duke of Ashford could be. "Will you have me?" he asked quietly. "Not as a convenient husband, not as a solution to financial crisis, but as a man who loves you more than he thought possible. Will you make this marriage real in every way for the rest of our lives?" Eleanor could barely see him through her tears. She pulled him up into her arms, holding him fiercely. "Yes," she whispered against his hair. "Yes, yes, yes, I want all of it, Alexander. Forever." When he kissed her this time, it was with all the passion and tenderness they had been suppressing for weeks. Eleanor felt herself melt into him, felt the last walls between them crumble into dust. This was what she had dreamed of as a girl. Not the cold transaction she had agreed to, but this: love freely given, partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection, passion tempered by deep understanding. "This union stands always," Alexander murmured against her lips, echoing the words he'd spoken on their strange, distant wedding night. "Tonight and every night hereafter." "Always," Eleanor agreed and sealed the promise with another kiss. Much later, as they sat curled together before the dying fire, Eleanor remembered something that made her laugh softly. "What is it?" Alexander asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was just thinking," Eleanor said, "about that first dinner at Ashford House before the wedding. You asked if I took sugar in my tea, and I said yes. Do you remember?" Alexander frowned slightly. "Vaguely. Why?" "Because this morning at breakfast, you automatically added sugar to my tea, without asking. You've learned my preferences, my habits, all the tiny details that matter. Somewhere along the way, you started paying attention. You started caring." Alexander tightened his arms around her. "I started caring the moment you looked at me in that first meeting and demanded to meet me before agreeing to marry. You were terrified, but determined, desperate, but dignified. I think I began falling in love with you then, though I was too stubborn to admit it." "We're both stubborn," Eleanor said with a smile, "but perhaps that means we're perfectly matched." "Perhaps it does," Alexander agreed. "My stubborn, brilliant, compassionate Duchess. I don't deserve you, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." "You already do," Eleanor assured him. "You already do." The fire burned down to embers, but neither noticed. They had years ahead of them to sit by fires, to share confidences and dreams, to build the life they had stumbled into by accident and chosen to keep by design. Their marriage of convenience had become, against all odds, a marriage of love. And Eleanor had never been happier in her life. Spring came to London with an exuberance that mirrored Eleanor's heart. The grey winter yielded to brilliant sunshine, daffodils bloomed in Hyde Park, and the world seemed reborn with possibility. 6 months had passed since her wedding day. 6 months that had transformed her life so completely that Eleanor sometimes had to remind herself it was all real, not some elaborate dream from which she might wake. The marriage that began as cold transaction had blossomed into genuine partnership and deep love. Eleanor no longer occupied her separate apartments in the East Wing. She shared Alexander's rooms, his bed, his life in every meaningful way. The formal distance of those early weeks had been replaced by easy intimacy. Morning kisses over breakfast, hands finding each other during evening walks, whispered conversations late into the night. Their hospital reform efforts had borne fruit beyond Eleanor's most optimistic hopes. Parliament had approved funding increases for 5 London hospitals, with provisions for better sanitation, more medical supplies, and improved staff training. Dr. Carmichael had wept openly when the news was announced, clasping both Eleanor's and Alexander's hands and declaring them angels of mercy. Eleanor had also discovered a talent for advocacy that surprised even herself. She spoke at charity gatherings, wrote letters to newspapers, organized fundraising events with the help of Agatha's influential social circle. Alexander supported her efforts completely, using his position to open doors and lend credibility to her causes. Their partnership extended beyond charity work. Alexander consulted Eleanor on estate matters, valuing her practical insights. Eleanor helped Alexander navigate the complex social obligations of his position, smoothing relationships and building alliances with her warmth and intelligence. They were, in every sense, a team. On a particularly lovely April morning, Eleanor sat in the Ashford House morning room, sunshine streaming through the tall windows, composing a letter to her brother Thomas. He had secured his commission in the regiment, thanks to funds Alexander had quietly provided, and was currently stationed in Hampshire, enjoying military life with enthusiasm that made Eleanor smile. "Another letter to Thomas?" Alexander asked, entering with the Times tucked under his arm. He leaned down to kiss the top of her head, a casual gesture of affection that still made Eleanor's heart flutter. "He's been promoted already," Eleanor said proudly. "His commanding officer says he shows remarkable leadership potential." "He's his sister's brother," Alexander replied with a warm smile. "Leadership and determination run in your family." He settled into the chair across from her, but instead of immediately opening his newspaper, he studied her with an expression Eleanor had learned to recognize. He had something important to say. "What is it?" she prompted gently. Alexander set aside the newspaper and leaned forward, taking her hand. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," he began, and Eleanor felt a moment of panic. Surely he wasn't going to revisit their agreement now, after everything. But Alexander's next words dispelled her fears completely. "Our original contract stipulated a year of marriage, followed by separation," he continued. "That year is half complete. I would like to formally dissolve that contract and replace it with something different." From his coat pocket, he withdrew a folded document. Eleanor took it with trembling fingers and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the elegant script. It was a new contract, or rather, a declaration. In legal language, it stated that the marriage of Alexander Colton, Duke of Ashford, and Eleanor Catherine Colton, Duchess of Ashford, was hereby declared genuine, permanent, and entered into with mutual affection and free will. All previous agreements regarding separation were null and void. The document concluded with a provision that made Eleanor's breath catch. Alexander was settling an additional £100,000 on Eleanor as her personal fortune, independent of his estate, to ensure she would always have complete financial autonomy. "Alexander," Eleanor whispered, overwhelmed, you don't have to—" "I want you to have independence," Alexander interrupted gently. "Not because I doubt our marriage, but because you should never feel trapped, never feel you must stay out of financial necessity. You chose to love me freely. I want you to continue choosing me freely every day, knowing you could leave if you wished and be perfectly secure." Tears streaked down Eleanor's cheeks. The gesture was so typically Alexander, practical and deeply romantic simultaneously, ensuring her freedom while declaring his commitment. "I will never leave," she said fiercely. "Never, Alexander. You're my home, my partner, my love. Forever." Alexander moved to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Then will you marry me again?" he asked, his grey eyes bright with emotion. "Not because of contracts or inheritances, not to save your family or secure my estates, but simply because we love each other and want to spend our lives together." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "We're already married." "Technically, yes," Alexander agreed with a slight smile. "But that ceremony was hollow, perfunctory. I want to marry you again, Eleanor. Properly this time, with real vows that mean everything. Small gathering, just family and close friends. No society spectacle. What do you say?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes." Alexander surged up to kiss her, pulling her from her chair and into his arms. The letter to Thomas fluttered, forgotten, to the floor as Eleanor wrapped her arms around her husband's neck and lost herself in his embrace. They held the second wedding ceremony 6 weeks later, on a perfect June morning at the small church on Alexander's country estate in Kent. The guests were few but precious, Eleanor's mother and Thomas, both glowing with happiness for her. Agatha, who had orchestrated much of the planning with gleeful determination. Dr. Carmichael and several other friends from Agatha's salon, and a handful of Alexander's close associates. Eleanor wore a simple gown of cream silk, elegant but unpretentious, with wildflowers woven into her auburn hair. Alexander stood waiting at the altar in a dark blue coat, his expression open and joyful in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months prior. This time, when the vicar asked if they took each other as husband and wife, their responses rang with absolute conviction. "I do," Alexander said, his voice strong and certain, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "I do," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and filled with joy. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, again and invited Alexander to kiss his bride. He did so with unhurried thoroughness, to the delighted applause and laughter of their small gathering. The wedding breakfast afterward was held in the gardens of Ashford Manor, under ancient oaks and flowering cherry trees. There were no uncomfortable silences, no strained pleasantries, just genuine celebration, good food, and the kind of happiness that comes from being surrounded by people who truly care. Agatha proposed a toast, her voice carrying across the garden. "To Alexander and Eleanor," she declared, raising her glass, "who proved that sometimes the most practical arrangements can lead to the most impractical, wonderful love. May you continue to confound expectations and build a life of purpose, passion, and genuine partnership." "To Alexander and Eleanor," the guests echoed, glasses chiming. Later that afternoon, as the celebration wound down and guests began departing, Eleanor and Alexander found themselves alone in the manor's rose garden. The scent of blooming roses perfumed the air, bees hummed industriously among the flowers, and the world seemed almost impossibly perfect. "Happy?" Alexander asked, pulling Eleanor into his arms. "Deliriously," Eleanor replied, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Though I still can't quite believe this is my life." "Believe it," Alexander murmured into her hair. "You're my Duchess, my wife, my love, and I intend to spend the rest of my days ensuring you never doubt it." They stood like that for long minutes, wrapped in each other and in contentment. Eventually, Eleanor pulled back slightly to look up at her husband. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't married?" she asked. "If we'd chosen differently?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think I would have secured my inheritance somehow, perhaps married someone equally desperate for money, lived that cold, separate life I'd resigned myself to, and you would have found some way to survive, to provide for your family. You're too strong and clever not to have managed somehow." "But we wouldn't have had this," Eleanor said softly. "No," Alexander agreed, "we wouldn't have had this. Which makes me grateful for my uncle's manipulative will, for your father's poor investments, for every circumstance that pushed us together. I don't believe in fate, Eleanor, but I believe in making the most of unexpected opportunities. You were the best unexpected opportunity of my life." "And you were mine," Eleanor replied. She rose on her toes to kiss him, sweet and lingering. "My unexpected, wonderful, beloved Duke." "Your Duke," Alexander affirmed. "Always." As summer deepened, Eleanor and Alexander settled into the kind of marriage poets write about, and cynics claim doesn't exist, a union of genuine affection, mutual respect, shared purpose, and abiding love. They divided their time between London and the Kent estate, continuing their charitable work while also simply enjoying each other's company. Eleanor discovered she was with child in August, news that sent Alexander into a state of delighted panic. He hired the best physicians, ensured Eleanor wanted for nothing, and fussed over her with such tender concern that she had to gently remind him she was pregnant, not made of glass. "I'm going to be impossible, aren't I?" Alexander said one evening, his hand resting protectively on Eleanor's still flat belly. "Completely," Eleanor agreed with a laugh, "but I love you anyway." Ooh. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with Alexander's dark hair and Eleanor's determined chin. They named him Edward, for Eleanor's late father, with Charles as his middle name for Alexander's. The christening was held at the same small church where they'd renewed their vows, with Agatha standing as godmother and Dr. Carmichael as godfather. Holding her son while standing beside her husband, surrounded by family and friends, Eleanor felt such overwhelming happiness that she actually laughed aloud. "What is it?" Alexander asked, looking at her with concern and amusement. "I was just thinking," Eleanor replied, gazing down at little Edward's sleeping face, "about that day I sat in Mr. Pembroke's office and learned my family was ruined. I thought my life was ending. I thought I was sacrificing everything. And instead," Alexander prompted gently, "instead I found everything I never knew I wanted," Eleanor finished. She looked up at her husband, her partner, her love. I found you. I found purpose. I found myself. That day wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Alexander leaned down to kiss her forehead, then their son's. The beginning of our story, he agreed. The best story I've ever been part of. And it was true. What began as pretense had become promise. What started as convenience had transformed into profound love. Eleanor and Alexander had stumbled into marriage expecting nothing and found everything. Years later, when their children, Edward was followed by daughters Margaret and Agatha, asked about their parents' love story, Eleanor would tell them the truth, that sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive disguised as desperate measures, that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil, and that the most pragmatic decisions can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. Your father and I married for all the wrong reasons, she would say with a smile, glancing at Alexander across the room, and somehow found all the right ones. And Alexander, overhearing, would cross the room to take her hand, to kiss her as though they were still newlyweds, to remind her without words that the union they'd believed was pretend had become the truest, most real thing in both their lives. This union stood always, tonight and every night hereafter, forever. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed Alexander and Eleanor's journey from a marriage of convenience to true love, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more romantic historical tales, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite moment in their story? Have you ever experienced an unexpected beginning that led to something wonderful? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, may you find your own unexpected love story.